topic is, this is an historical piece. We're talking next week about what do we feel that exile, COVID, and all this kind of stuff and has impact on the church. But what I'm doing today is I'm talking specifically about the exilic period. Why is this a critical period for the creation of the faith as we know it? The cornerstones of modern day Judaism begin in this exilic period, and from that Christianity. And so I think it's a useful exile as a general theme. Exile is one of those moments of any form of exile, and what we'll be looking at in the actual discussion next week is in many ways the kind of the exile of the modern church, and especially in the consequences of COVID-19. But today I will be talking in particular about kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the nature of the exile, and what happens when we return, and the kind of the evolution. One of the phrases that I often kind of resort to is, and this was from a TV show that I highly recommend, and you can actually find on YouTube, called Testament by John Romer. And he talks about the origins of the Bible, and the phrase that he would use is the exiles entered Babylon as Judeans and they came back as Jews. It's a bit of a simplification, but I think in general it does hold very true. So we're going to start with Psalm 137. By Babylon's streams, there we sat. Oh, we wept when we recalled Zion. On the poplars there, we hung up our lyres. For there our captors had asked of us words of songs, and our plunderers rejoicing, sing us from Zion's songs. How can we sing a song of the Lord in foreign land? Should I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand wither. May my tongue cleave to my palate if I do not recall you. If I do not set Jerusalem above my chief joy. Recall, O Lord, the Edomites on the day of Jerusalem, saying, raise it to its foundations. Daughters of Babylon, the despoiler, happy who pays your back in kind for what you did to us. Happy who seizes and smashes your infants against the rock. A psalm of exile. And we can definitely, this is a psalm written by a community traumatized. I've often made reference to the Bible as a work of trauma. How do people recover from trauma? And the exilic period is very much that model. How does a community, a leadership, a group of people who have reached what they think is the heights of being in a relationship with God, and then one day it's all over, what happens next? To begin the process of exploring that, it's useful to have a bit of background about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now, I'm not going to say too much about the historical accuracy of the King David, Solomon, and all that kind of stuff. I think it's useful to kind of keep in mind that we do have archaeological evidence of the existence of a dynasty called the House of David. We don't know how powerful they were, how big the kingdoms were, and all that kind of stuff. I tend to view David in roughly the same kind of setup as Arthur, King Arthur. But there was an historical figure called David who may have played a role in beginning to reunite the tribes of Israel in some kind of coalition against various enemies. And as often happens with such stories, more and more stories are added on, and they become this foundational myth of the kingdom. The United Kingdom of Israel, as it was known in the Bible, in roughly about 1,000 years before Common Era, divides. The 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, form the Kingdom of Israel, which very soon loses its link with the house of David. It engages in it's always kind of a kind of language to use. One of the key elements in both Israel and Judah at this time, it's useful to kind of reflect on, is they worship God, but not in the sense that we would understand it. In modern day Christianity and modern day Judaism, there's no argument. There's only one God. The monotheistic faith. Christianity kind of confuses the issue with Trinity to some extent, but in general, there is one God. No other gods exist. And that's kind of, it's a basic fact. Now, the situation in the kingdoms of Judah and Israel is actually more complicated. To varying degrees, particularly outside the urban areas in the rural hinterlands of Judah and Israel, there were various cultic practices where God was worshipped, but as part of a larger pantheon. You often, you'll come across, for example, God Yahweh with his consort Asherah and such and such. There was a variety of cultic practices where the Canaanite folk religion, for want of a better way of putting it, was still very much part of the religious experience of the people of Israel and Judah. There were, the temple in Jerusalem was considered to be like the main source of the Davidic covenant between God and the people of Israel. There was just the one God as far as Jerusalem was concerned. But there's a more easygoing, more kind of, we worship God, but God has a wife, and God has a court. And you can even see this in some of the early writings. They do talk about God being the first God amongst the other gods. There isn't a right. I can't remember exactly what the official term is, but they weren't monotheists. They worshipped one God, but they acknowledged the existence of others. One of that was not my favorite praise and worship songs. Our God is an awesome God. In many ways, that was probably the kind of the worship life of ancient Israel and ancient Judah. Our God is an awesome God, and better than your God. So that's the kind of the folk religion that exists in this period. And it exists to very important degrees over from 1000 BCE to 500 BCE. The kingdom of Israel lasts from 1000 BCE to 720. They're destroyed by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were one of the superpowers of the region. The people were deported. This was a very common practice in the ancient world. Populations were moved from one region to another and then other populations were brought in to replace them, because the key element that any superpower at this time wanted was people to work the land. It didn't matter who they were, if they were an indigenous population or whatever, as long as there were people there to work the land and pay their taxes. So the 10 tribes of Israel have become the kind of mystery. Where of the 10 tribes of Israel, where were they deported to? Well, more likely they were deported to various places in Iraq. That's how it worked. But it became the fun game. They ended up in Africa, they ended up in Asia, and there's traces of them and even in America and all this kind of. And it's kind of a fun game to play with the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Some of the refugees from Israel would have fled to Judah. Now, Judah and Israel, though had been born from the same kingdom, the United Kingdom of David and Solomon, they were not partners. They were more like rivals. The kingdom of Judah would develop a particular ideology, a royal ideology. And at the basis of this royal ideology was that the covenant was basically, the covenant between God and the people was mediated through the king, in particular the house of David. That the combination of the temple cult in Jerusalem and the house of David were the cornerstones of God's presence in the land. And if you worshipped God, you were expected to adhere to the ideology that the house of David had been granted power over Judah. Now, they were supposed to be the shepherd of the people. They were supposed to look after the people and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, that's what kings always say. Now, like Israel, they would often get entangled in the superpower politics. And one of the things that seems to be kind of one of the traits of Judah was they were very good at seeming to be in the wrong side of a conflict. You know, they would usually end up in the wrong end. They would, like, if the Egyptians were going after the Assyrians, and Judah would pick the side of the Egyptians, and then would be like, what just happened? Why did the Assyrians knock the living daylights out of us? And often the kingdom would become a client, like they would be kind of brought under the heel of Assyria or Egypt for a while, do what they were told, and then get resentful, decide to rebel, and then the Assyrians would come in and knock the living daylights out. Now, but what often would happen was that the kingdom endured. And this would, this would only strengthen the royal ideology. It didn't matter that things were not great. It didn't matter that Judah was becoming smaller, his resources were being drained in these ongoing wars and whatever. The kingdom endured. So the idea was that the king still had the support of God, that the royal covenant between God and the house of David was still in play. And there was a couple of incidents in particular where at one point they were attacked by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were just about to knock them out. And then there's a sudden plague. God sent the plague. Now, plagues happened all the time. And the Assyrians were kind of like, they already had Judah on the ropes. So they had already got a huge bribe from the king and the like. So it's not like they needed to stick around anymore. They got a whole whack of cash. They got some, a whole bunch of signs of submission. They're not going to make things worse by, dealing with a huge plague situation. But this royal ideology is still there. And it's this royal ideology that becomes the source of tension in Judah between, and it also had been an issue in Israel as well, and it still exists. This is where the prophets come in. The role of the prophet, as I've mentioned before, was always to be a social, economic, political, religious critic of what was going on in Judah or Israel at the time. And a sense of that these were people who saw the corruption of the covenant. That this was not what God had intended. That the people would suffer because of the decisions of the kings. That the people would be forced to work on building projects, to build palaces for the king because of their egos, or people would be conscripted into armies to fight against the Egyptians and Syrians. As far as the prophets were concerned, to varying degrees, this is not what God had meant. Even in terms of worshiping the temple, the various ornate, this is one of the things that Judah becomes like other nations. They only worship one God, but the way they worship that one God is not much different from, say, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, Edomites, and whatever. They offer great sacrifices. They have, choirs performing in the Psalms and all this kind of stuff. And so, if you were to be a traveler from Phoenicia and you were to go into Jerusalem to watch the rites being practiced there, you wouldn't see that much difference. Massive sacrifices and trying to impress the God. The prophets were railing against this. There's one interesting, and this becomes critical for what happens during exile. So this is why I want to spend a little bit of time on. There is one king, a King Josiah, who is kind of one of the few good kings. It is fair to say that the Bible does not like kings and does not have much good to say about the various kings who ruled in Judah. I think they only count one or two good ones. And this is over a period of a couple hundred years. So there's a lot of kings for them to say, yeah, as one of my favorite Scottish phrases, good for nothing, they'll come to nothing. King Josiah is one of the good ones, according to the Bible. What makes him good, quote unquote, is that he engaged and he reigns from 640 to 609. And actually he was, Jeremiah, the prophet, knew of King Josiah, supported his work, and lamented his death in battle because, like, he picked once more, picked the wrong side, got involved in a struggle, and was killed in battle. But before that, what is supposed to have happened is that he went into the temple, and with the aid of some of the temple staff, they had discovered some secret. They had discovered lost documents. Lost documents. One is, as I've got listed here, the Book of the Law. The Book of Law. Now, we don't actually know whether these genuine lost documents or were these forgeries drawn up by Josiah and his supporters to initiate a religious reform that would completely renew the relationship between God and the people. Josiah was monotheistic. There was only one God. As far as he was concerned, there was none of this nonsense of God having partners, God having courts or whatever. There was only one God. He would engage in a campaign of destroying the various cultic centers that had like sacred groves of sacred trees, God and Asherah and all this kind of stuff. But as far as he was concerned, this all had to be purged. The Book of Law would become a critical component of all of this. This was supposedly the rediscovery of the relationship between God and the people as mediated through the text. And this will be, as I said, spoiler alert, this is big in exile. So, this is the historical background. The kingdom of Judah teeters from one crisis to another. And the royal ideology seems to have a really major influence, and to be honest, there are delusions of self-importance. They think that God will bail them out. They won't like it. There'll be a client state, they'll have to offer tribute and whatever, but the kingdom will endure. God will come through. They'll get their knuckles rapped, they'll pay off the bribe and whatever, but God will see them through. Until one day God decides, nope, not happening anymore. Or more realistically, they've had enough. The arrogance of the kings of Judah, which may well have been profoundly shaped by their royal ideology, led to the last crisis. And in 587, Jerusalem will be sacked. The kingdom will be destroyed. The temple will be destroyed. The Babylonians have had enough. So what happens? The Babylonians, we're not sure exactly how many people they take. The numbers are usually kind of between 5,000 to 10,000. And this is only a small percentage of the population of Judah. What they've done is they've decapitated the state, for one better way of putting it. They've taken the leadership, the king, the courtiers, the great financial people of the reign, the armies, the generals, and whatever, the clergy of the temple, the leadership. They've took them and they're taking them to Babylon. Some flee, others flee to Egypt. One of the kind of interesting bits and pieces in all of this is that the exilic community in Babylon is the one we know about. That's the big one. That's where all the stuff happens. But there are other exilic communities. Some flee to Egypt, others flee to parts of Asia Minor, and many stay. You know, the folk religion of Yahweh, you know, God, continues to exist, associated with the various Canaanite religions and whatever. So the bulk of the population of Judah, the farmers, the people who work in the land, they're still there. You know, they don't get transported. You know, they're still there. They don't have a leadership to look to in Jerusalem. We don't hear much about prophets or anything living amongst them at this time. They're there. They endure, but we don't hear much of their stories. So 587, they're in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is becomes desolate. For 2 generations, you know, the exiles live in Babylon. Babylon itself is one of the great cities. It's a meeting place of so many different faiths, different traditions, different cultures. You know, it's like the New York of this region. And it's one of the great powers until it is conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great, who conquers Babylon in 539 BCE. And by all accounts, was not that much of a battle. You know, the Persians were actually quite, by the standards of the time, and that's quite a quite qualifier. The Persians, as an imperial power, were tended to be a fairly light hand. They wanted to make sure the taxes kept them flowing in, but they were not in a huge rush to impose their religious beliefs and whatever, and such and such. They wanted to keep taxes coming in. They still engage in some deportations of populations all over the empire. But you know, in general, being ruled by the Persians, if you had to have a choice, what imperial ruler would you like? You know, like none, but no, that's not an option. Sorry, the Persians would probably be fairly high up. What happens in exile? This is what we're building up to. Once more, they entered Babylon as Judeans and returned as Jews. Profound transformation. Now, I'm not saying this is true for all the exiles. There were, you know, like one of the things that's always useful to remember that when they were allowed to return, a fair whack of the exiles said, no, thank you very much. We'll stay in Babylon, thank you. We're kind of like the urban life, and the idea of heading back to the wilds of Judah and Jerusalem don't really appeal to us. You know, no nasty adventures for us. But all that being said, the exile is a time of questions. Wasn't God supposed to protect us? Wasn't that the deal we'd signed? Hadn't God promised to protect the house of David, whatever the circumstances? Can we worship God in a strange land without the infrastructure of the temple? Who do we offer sacrifices to? Where do we offer them? The answer is yes, they can. One of the critical elements of the exile is that this is when they become a people of the word, of the text. And this is the legacy of the work of Josiah. Josiah had found the text or created the text, whatever you want to say. But it's with these texts, with those study, with this process that would have, you know, the Bible itself would be born. The Bible, as we begin to know it, would be born during exile, because this is a period of scribes. They'll look at the text, try to understand what is being said. What is the canon? What books are part of, the epic tale of the foundation of Israel, the great story of the kingdom of David and Solomon. Those stories had been with the people for generations, and now they're being written down, and they're being explored, and they're being influenced. Babylon was the center of so many vibrant cultures. And once the Persian Empire had become part of the equation, there's some major influence there. The Persian elites, the rulers, to varying degrees, embraced the religion that we now know as Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism is probably one of the earliest monotheistic faiths around. As I've hopefully helped to explain, it probably predates the religion of the Bible as a strict monotheistic belief. And one of the critical contributions, especially for Christianity, from Zoroastrianism is dualism, the struggle between light against darkness, good against evil. And Zoroastrianism was a belief that there was the God of light, and that we as people are engaged in this epic struggle to support the God of light against the forces of darkness. This didn't exist in Judaism and in the time of the kingdoms. People knew that evil was a reality, but it was just part of the background. There were droughts, famine, war. Evil was just there. This idea of this epic struggle between God and Satan, as we have, that didn't, that was not part of the belief system. Satan, for those who talked about him, Satan was part of the royal court. Satan had a job. He actually worked for God. It was not a nice job. It was, as we hear in the book of Job, but this epic struggle between good against evil, that was not part of Judaism as, and certainly, but the seeds would be planted. One of the critical elements of exile is the willingness of the people to ask themselves the question, those who were willing to ask the question, how did we get here? What happened? And in some cases, what did we do wrong? How did we fail? Exile was a profound humbling to a covenant people who had been told for generations that God would always bail them out. That God would always, that God had made this promise to the house of David, that God would always be with people. In exile, they start to ask themselves the question, what does this really mean? Like, did God support the kingdom and its ambitions? Did God support the dreams of kings and the clergy of the temple? Or did God hope for something different? Is there a possibility of saying that the dream had been corrupted, had been twisted out of shape? How did we get here? Is it God's will? Now, from the historical perspective, how they got there was business as usual. That's how empires work. Empires have short patience, and after a while, the Judeans had just, there was one string left, and that was it. But what happens is a hope of renewal starts to kind of percolate once the trauma, once the, Psalm 137. Let's go back to Psalm 137 for a second. Psalm 137 is a psalm of trauma. Where are you, God? Why are we being taunted by these people? Why are we sitting by the rivers of Babylon and weeping? Shouldn't we be in Jerusalem? Shouldn't we be in your holy city? And you can hear the anger, the visceral anger, the grudges, like, the Edomites who said, why don't you make sure you raze it to the ground, destroy it utterly. And this, the hope at the end, smash the babies against the wall. Wow. But, that utter rage that you would ask God to revenge your pain, your trauma on the people by killing the innocents. What did babies have to do with the fact that you are paying the price for the failed policies of your kingdom? That if you had behaved yourselves, that if you had known your place, if you had kept your nose clean, all the kind of things, they're not really supposed, but in the superpower politics of the era, if they had been more low-key, if they had been more understanding of what God wants them to be, which is a sign of God's presence in the world, as opposed to this kind of delusions of grandeur that in the end of the day has led you to this. So one thing that happens is a re-examination of the ministry of the prophets, a re-examination of the royal ideology. Some still hope for a renewed covenant based on a renewed house of David that would understand what it truly means to be the shepherd of the people. That it wouldn't be an ongoing cycle of wars and annoying people and whatever. It would be a shepherd who would look after them, who would protect the people from the enemies, but not engage in wars of conflict and whatever. We have one of the kind of things that emerges from exile, and I've made reference to this before, but certainly is important to mention again. The renewed relationship with God following a pattern of three-stage pattern: judgment, lament, hope. Exile is a period of judgment. They failed. They had not understood what God had wanted them to be in the world. They had been seduced by visions of grandeur, of importance, of self-importance. They had let the kings guide them into these conflicts, these continuous wars, building projects, whatever. And the day of judgment had come. And this was something that the prophets had warned them of consistently. And the prophets have been warning the people about this for hundreds of years, beginning with before the first king was ever anointed. Samuel had told the people, this is what's going to happen when you pick kings. It's not going to work. It is not the way of God. In exile, they are confronted with the reality. And this leads to lament. What have they lost? What have they lost in walking away from the hope that God had placed upon them? Some of the folks in exile would start to look at the kind of the long history of the people of Israel. And one thing that would be a fairly common theme of The sojourn in the wilderness, the 40 years wandering around the Sinai Peninsula, had been one of the greatest times of the history of Israel, because they had been with God. There had been no kingdoms, there had been no great building projects, whatever. But there was God and the people. Some had began to notice that the way of kings was not healthy for the people. That because of this way of kings, they had lost something critical. That they had lost a direct connection of people and God through the covenant. So there's lament. What have we lost? But there's also hope. That if the people are willing to engage in this task of exploration, of reflection, of where did we go wrong? What mistakes did we make? How can we renew ourselves so we will not make these mistakes again? How can we be renewed as the people of God? Then will God listen to us? Will God be with us again? The answer is yes. This is something that, as we've heard in the last couple of weeks with Jeremiah, what Jeremiah and the other prophets will do is say to the people, God will be with you. What you're invited to do is look beyond your limitations, your expectations, and look for God in different places. Can God be found in the courts of Babylon? Yeah. Can God be found in the slums of Babylon? God's waiting for you. In the temples of Egypt. I could go on, but there's a beginning of a universal understanding here that we're not talking about, this is beginning a wave of kind of the Jews converting people. That's not really the case. But what we do see is an awareness of the larger picture and of God in the world, not limited to the temple in Jerusalem, not limited to this kind of parochial God is with the house of David or whatever. What we're beginning to see is a kind of a stumbling towards a return maybe. Well, not. In Scripture we have the Noahide covenant, which is one of the kind of the earliest visions of God signing a covenant with all of humanity. And so it's part of this larger world. Judaism begins to emerge as a distinct monotheistic religion that is distinct. As I said earlier, the religion of the worship of one God practiced in Israel and practiced in Judah before all of this, it wasn't that distinct. Even in terms of what is ethical codes, like there's laws and all this kind of stuff, the book of law and whatever, those existed in non those existed in non-Yahweh religious experiences. What becomes unique in exile is a community that are members of the community. As I said, there would be people in the exiles who'd be like, yeah, knock yourself out. I'm leading the good life here or whatever. But there would be those who would be kind of like, what does it mean to worship God in a strange land? Is it possible to do so? And as I said, the answer is yes. If you are willing to open your mind to that possibility, that God can be encountered in the places that are unfamiliar to you. Now, there are some who yearn for the old ways, the old ways. you hear this in the Psalms, you hear this in the stories of Scripture. The golden age of David and Solomon, when the kingdom was relevant and important. Others are like, it's time to move on. So exile lasts from 587 to the first order of return, which is in 538 BCE. And that was issued by, and we have copies of these edicts from Cyrus the Great. Cyrus, he himself is an interesting figure in that Koresh was his name in Persian, and anyone who has some memories of history might remember a David Koresh from a few decades ago. But Kairos was seen by some people as a Messiah-style figure, even though he was not part of the people of God, because he issued the return order that invited the Jewish leadership to return back to Jerusalem and Judah. And this would happen over a series of generations of people who would return back to Judah. But they would return as subjects of the Persian Empire. That's it. No more kingdom. This is what the Persians are extremely clear on. You are subjects of the Persian Empire. You will have a ruling class, mainly scribes, temple officials, whatever, but there will be no more kings. You will offer military units to fight on behalf of the Persian Empire. You will pay your taxes to the empire, and we'll leave you alone. And actually, that's what happens. By all accounts, subjects of the Persian Empire, the Jewish community in Jerusalem and Judah are very loyal. There's no indication of any rebellions or anything like that. There's no attempt to restore the house of David, for example. That doesn't happen. And even when the Persians are defeated by Alexander and his gang of bully boys in the 330s, in the aftermath of the breakup of his conquering the Persian Empire and the creation of new kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and whatever, the Jews remain a subject people. They remain either subjects of the Ptolemies of Egypt, the Greek dynasty that rules from Alexandria, or they remain subjects of the Seleucid dynasty that rules from Syria. They don't regain their independence until the Maccabean revolt, and even then, once more, it's not the house of David that reigns. It's another dynasty, and that only lasts for a couple of generations before they're conquered by the Romans. So, for a few hundred years, there is no great inclination amongst the Jewish community to restore a kingdom independent on itself. They are quite content in the leadership and by looks at the people to be part of this nation of scribes, this nation of priests, this province, I should say, that explore scripture. There's a lot, the scripture continues to evolve during this era, and in terms of the various books or how they're written. I want to kind of wrap up with for me, one of the most potent images of, to me, it's one of the most strongest symbols of the change. I like to call it restoration of a sort. The book of Nehemiah, and for me, this has been one of the most, I've shared a story before, but I'm always repeating myself, so why not? Years ago, when I was attending an event in Victoria, I was kind of in a weird headspace. And I'd hoped to attend the worship service, at the Sunday worship service, and I hoped to be fed by it. And to be honest, it was not helping. And it's some kind of, I can't remember the music or whatever, but it was grating on my nerves. And then this young woman came up to the pulpit and read from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8. And it's, to put it simply, it's the chapter where the people of Israel gather in the various courts of Jerusalem. And Ezra is one of the returning exiles, reads out the book of law. And he tells the people this is a day of celebration. There's a lot of emotion. People are weeping, people are tears, whatever. But Ezra is clear, this is a day of celebration because they're now back in Jerusalem listening to the law being proclaimed, the law of Moses. Restoration. And later on we hear of the temple, whatever. For me, what is powerful about this piece is the law being read out. It's not so much the temple infrastructure or whatever. It is listening to the law of Moses in the courts of the city of Jerusalem, hearing that things have been restored. So a couple of closing sentences. That's some historical context about exile. The importance of exile is a time of reflection, a time of asking ourselves, where did things go wrong? What is expected of us? What do we learn from that past? And what does the future look like for us? The key element in all of this is the awareness that God is with you. That despite what we have done, despite our failings, despite our challenges, God is with us in this time of exile. And God is challenging us to look beyond our expectations, our delusions, whatever term you want to use, and say, okay, what's next? What does it look like? Have a conversation. Because this is the thing, and I maybe should have touched on this a bit more, this is the thing that happens in exile, is conversations. We don't have records of them, but there has to be conversations. And one of the things that I think is probably pretty clear about exile is the barriers that existed in the kingdom between the kings, the exile, whatever, they've all been stripped away. As far as the Babylonians are concerned, and then the Persians, you're all deportees. All the distinctions that you thought were important in Jerusalem, don't exist anymore. You're all subjects of the Babylonian Empire and living in your little ghettos. Deal with it. So there has to be conversations. There has to be reaching out, different points of view, observations, revelations, epiphanies, whatever term you want to use, they're all over the place. And it gets boiled, and some of it becomes distilled in this new vision of the relationship of the people, mediated through the text, through the Bible. And this is the first critical stage that will lead to the next stage, which is the stage of the destruction of the temple in 60 and the Great Jewish Revolt, and the aftermath of that, which has, once more, the text becomes the cornerstone. So that's it. That's my talk on the exile.